It's 10 p.m. here in the French capital. Here are your top world headlines. A genius, a hero, the greatest to ever play the game. Diego Maradona set to be laid to rest in his native Argentina as tearful tributes to the legendary football star pour in from around the world one day after his death. The Ethiopian military will begin the final phase of its offensive in the embattled Tigray region, according to the country's prime minister. This after an ultimatum expired for Tigrayan forces to surrender. Also coming up in the program, France's plan to ease lockdown in 3 phases. The first phase beginning this Saturday, when non-essential shops will be able to reopen. Thanks for tuning in to France 24. I'm Claire Rush. Argentinians are bidding a final tearful farewell to their national hero, Diego Maradona, this Thursday evening, as a legendary footballer is set to be laid to rest in Buenos Aires. His funeral coming just hours after his casket lay in state at the Casa Rosada presidential palace, draped in an Argentinian flag and his famous number 10 jersey. Now, for more on Maradona's burial procession, which you can see in these images here in Buenos Aires, we cross live to our Buenos Aires correspondent, Declan McGarvey. Now, Declan, there's been an outpouring of public grief today in Argentina, and it seems to be a pretty charged atmosphere there, even erupting in clashes at times. Describe it for us.
Well, it's been a roller coaster last few hours here in Buenos Aires. Emotions of pain, grief, but also anger. As thousands of mourners and well-wishers first filed past the coffin of Diego Maradona within the presidential palace. Tears were spilt, jerseys were thrown at the foot of the coffin, football shirts, fists were pumped and kisses blown and rosaries and flowers thrown over the coffin as well. But outside the presidential palace, there were also clashes between police and mourners as more mourners tried to get into the presidential palace. At one point, police had to use tear gas to disperse mourners who had pushed through barriers and police cordons to get into the presidential palace to pay their last respects to Diego Maradona. And Diego Maradona's coffin also had to be removed into a separate area of the palace for its own safekeeping. Now, as we're talking now in the last few minutes, that lying in state of Diego Maradona has now finished, and a funeral cortege is carrying Diego Maradona from the presidential palace to a cemetery about 40 kilometers west of the capital city, Buenos Aires, where Diego Maradona, in the next hour or so, will be put to rest alongside the remains of his mother and father at his family's tomb.
Now, Maradona was so much more than just a football player for Argentina. Even the president and the vice president visited his casket this Thursday. Why does his passing cut so deep for Argentinians?
Well, as Argentinians have expressed today, he was everything for Argentinians. The names used for him are gods, adjectives used to describe him are immortal. Now, this is not only because he was arguably the greatest footballer ever, which is a source of great national pride for Argentina, but it's also about what he achieved in 1986, not only using his amazing skills on the football pitch to drag what is a very mediocre Argentine national team at that point to the ultimate goal of World Cup glory. But you have to put that within the context of what was happening in Argentina at that time. The darkest and bloodiest hour in Argentina's modern history had only just ended in the years before, a brutal dictatorship that had ended the lives of some 30,000 Argentinians, and the atrocities of which were only coming to light in 1986. It was 4 years after defeat in the Falklands War with Britain. Argentina at that point, around 1986, and the World Cup triumph via Diego Maradona, Argentina was on its knees morally at its lowest web, and Diego Maradona, by dragging the national team to World Cup glory, put Argentina back in the international spotlight in a positive way for the first time in years and gave an exhausted nation back its national pride. And for those reasons, he's forever remembered and esteemed.
Now, Maradona will, of course, go down in history for his athletic skill, but he'll also be remembered for his political activism, won't he?
Diego Maradona was a very politicized figure. He was a child of the slums of Buenos Aires, like 40% of the population of Argentina. He was born into poverty. He made it into being a global superstar. But as people are very fond of saying, and as Argentinian people have said throughout the day, he never forgot where he was from. And he was outspoken in his defense of the poorer and working classes in Argentina. He was a big supporter of the leftist pink tide governments that took power throughout South America in the early 2000s. He was a big ally and a personal friend of the Castros in Cuba, and indeed spent many months in Cuba for treatment for drug and alcohol addiction. And he will be fondly remembered by all of these people, as well as the ordinary Argentinians who they feel that he did so much to speak about their plight and about the troubles that the poor and the working classes in Argentina have to go through on a daily basis.
All right, well, thank you for that. Declan McGarvey, our correspondent in Buenos Aires, will be coming back to him later in the program. Now, if there's anywhere else in the world that will mourn Diego Maradona as much as Argentina, it's probably Naples. The Argentinian superstar was seen as a god in the southern Italian city. He led Napoli to its only 2 Serie A titles and its only major European trophy. Now, for more on how Italians are reacting to Maradona's passing, the Cross Life Tour Italy correspondent Seema Gupta. Seema, tell us more about the impact Maradona had in Naples and Italy more generally.
Well, in Naples, of course, as you mentioned, I mean, he's probably the most successful in terms of club football career in the city, playing for Napoli. He played between 1984 to 1991, 7 seasons, and crucially won those 2 Scudetto. That's the Serie A title. And it was the first time at the time that you had a southern Italian team winning against those big northern teams. It's the poorer south that came up on top. So also bearing in mind the humble beginnings of Diego Maradona, and that's why perhaps people hold him so close to their hearts. He's much beloved in the city, treated almost like a cult figure. You've got murals, street art, and even an altar in the city with what is said to be a lock of his hair there. Now, today and yesterday, we already saw a shrine of sorts being developed just outside the Napoli San Paolo Stadium. People bringing candles, bouquets of flowers, pictures of Maradona. People bring their children there as well, standing there in silence. Some people crying, others praying. Many who were interviewed said that they broke down in tears when they heard the news that he had passed, because of all that he represented for the city and all that he represented in terms of great football. So clearly a lot of emotional people in the town of Naples, but across the country as well. I mean, this was a figure that was followed very closely throughout because of the impact that he had in terms of football in the country, and also for what he represented in terms of getting through his various struggles.
Now, darker chapters of Maradona's life also played out in Italy. His time there was shrouded in controversy as well, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I mean, he had his fortunes in Naples, but also that is where he is said to have developed his drug problem, his addictions, really that plagued him throughout his life. And it started there. It was also said that there is where he had connections with organized crime gangs, the Camorra. It's been reported that he did have the connections with them. And then, of course, there was the entire issue of his taxes, this contentious issue of tax evasion. For many years, he could not return to Italy because it was believed that he would be arrested on arrival. Eventually, that issue was settled, and then in 2017, he was even given an honorary citizenship from the city of Italy. On top of that, he also fathered a child with a woman in Naples for many years, not recognizing this child, and eventually reconciling with this adult child, a son that he had with a woman from that town.
The mayor of Naples has started the process to rename the city's stadium after Maradona. What kind of official reactions and announcements have we been hearing in Italy today?
Well, one of the key things really that a lot of people have talked about is the fact that the news about his death was reported to Pope Francis, and he responded by saying that he has remembers Diego Maradona very affectionately and is praying for him. It's important to note that Pope Francis, an Argentinian himself, someone who is passionate about football, did meet Maradona several times after he became Pope at the Vatican. And in fact, Maradona himself said that Pope Francis was someone that he felt he could relate to because of the Pope's emphasis on helping the poor and those who need the help the most in society. On top of that, you've also had political reaction here in Italy, with the Prime Minister bidding a fond farewell to what he said was an eternal champion, that is Diego Maradona. And it was across the political spectrum, because you also had Matteo Salvini in the opposition expressing a tribute to Diego Maradona. So the worlds of entertainment, from the sporting world as well, all coming up with tributes to this man who clearly seems to have crossed all kinds of boundaries. And as you mentioned, the mayor of Naples calling for not just a day of mourning today, but also calling for the San Paolo Stadium, the Napoli Stadium, to be renamed the Diego Armando Maradona Stadium. And I think that will probably be taken up, as we've seen the people of the city there all day yesterday and today to express their sorrow at the death of Maradona.
Seema Gupta, France 24's Italy correspondent, reporting live for us there. Now, our sports editor, James Vecina, joins us now here in the studio. Now, James, Maradona, considered by many to be the greatest football player of all time.
Absolutely.
Tell us more about that.
I mean, where do you start? He's had such a career. He's been, obviously left an impression on many places, many teams and many places across, many just people across the globe. Where to start? Perhaps if we look at Boca Juniors, where he really made a name for himself in his homeland. And that's before being transferred, of course, over to Europe, where he joined Barcelona in what was a records transfer deal, $7 million dollars at the time. And his time there didn't really prove he wasn't able to show his full potential. Spent quite a bit of time injured, but then after that, it was his transfer really over to Napoli, where it would have been the last. You wouldn't have imagined what was to come for Napoli and how the team was doing back then at the time when Maradona came in. So this record signing and really bringing up Napoli to just to glories, 2 league wins, something that's they had never seen until then, and I think what's really impressive when you see how he was accepted by the people, by the residents of the city over there. At first, of course, it was a difficult move. He was the outsider, and always kind of remained, in a way, in his personality. But when they really got to experience what Maradona had to offer for himself, you just saw him welcomed by the fans in the stadiums in just some of the most impressive ways possible. And then when I'm talking about that, I'm thinking of one of the games against Juventus, which was in 1985. Just a free kick, really, it was a free kick, but it was perfectly executed. But at that point, you just saw the stadium just erupt, and that was the welcoming, the hugging of Maradona from the stands. And then, of course, after that, we saw him play with the Argentinian national team, and we go on to, of course, the 1986 World Cup, the infamous Hand of God, the very bitter for some fans, especially in England. And of course, there'll be some talk about, fair play and what happened in there. Obviously, we've got to put it into the larger political context of the time as well, how important that victory. And in a way, that goal, just what he was trying to say with that to his the opposition in there with that move. However, even if we're going to talk about fair play after that, he did go on to score one of possibly the greatest goals of all time, bringing England's defence, bashing through England's defence, and just getting the goalie to the ground to score what was an absolute stunner. And that is really it's often resumes that Diego Maradona, we can see both sides of him in that game. The worst, as in from the fair play and what could come out of him to win. Obviously, a very competitive person, as any high-level athlete is. And then the simple genius on the field.
So really big highlights, career highlights, as you just described there. Are those the highlights that made him into this cult-like figure that we know today?
Definitely. I mean, a lot of things, you would think, would this be happening today at that point? And there's no way we can, there's every argument to this. Everyone has their favourite player, and we've got several names that will always come up for being the best football player of all time. One of those, of course, that often comes up in the same sentence will be Pelé, of course. But in a way, what we've seen with what's been happening today with the outpouring of tributes across the world, in his homeland, in Napoli, then there was really this side where the people could connect to Maradona, connect to the player, because he was... His aim, as we've heard just earlier on, was to really remain part of the people and stick to his roots.
Yes, and as we can see in these live images here in Buenos Aires, his funeral procession, tens of thousands of people flocked to see his casket today. Just a fraction of the tributes that have been pouring in Argentina. Can you tell us more about the tributes from the sporting world that have also been coming?
Yeah, I mean, from the sporting world, of course, it's a great loss. It's a loss for everyone, but the sporting world, I mean... It's something it comes as a shock, and it's disappointment, and a lot of people he's an idol for so many people, and clubs, of course, have been coming up paying tributes, the greatest in history, a myth. The superlatives just don't end. Boca Juniors, who we were just mentioning, saying thank you to the eternal Diego. And as Sima was just mentioning earlier on, renaming of the stadium in Napoli to Diego Armando Maradona, changing the name from the name of a saint to today, which really, from San Paolo to Maradona, which really shows the proportion to which, the proportion that he takes in people's lives.
All right. Well, thank you so much, James Vicina, our sports editor, filling us in on everything that's been happening today following the death of football legend Diego Maradona. We will, of course, be following that throughout the program, so stay tuned for more of that. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed says he's ordered the army to move on Mekelle, the capital of the embattled Tigray region. Abiy says it's the final phase of the military operation, and it comes after his expired ultimatum for Tigray leaders to surrender. Abiy has warned the city's nearly 500,000 residents to stay inside. With all communications in the region cut, however, it remains difficult to verify claims about the fighting, which erupted 3 weeks ago between Ethiopian forces and Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, which was the country's dominant political force until Abiy came to power in 2018. Now, there's also been a humanitarian crisis unfolding amid the fighting in Ethiopia. Erin Agunke tells us more.
As tens of thousands of refugees flee violence in Ethiopia, medical clinics in neighboring Sudan are now overwhelmed, making it increasingly difficult for patients with urgent injuries to access timely care. Among them, Alam Kafa, who was hit by shrapnel from an explosion in his hometown. With just a stick as a crutch, he walked for 3 days to reach this clinic and is still waiting to be transferred to a hospital. Aid organizations say they're confronted with up to 90 new patients per day, most of whom have prevalent diseases like diarrhea, chest infections, and malaria.
Just to imagine if for everything, literally for everything, starting from your food, ending with your water drinking, ending just to go for the toilet facilities and washing your hand, for everything you depend on somebody else. This is really a very dire situation. I can't stress much how difficult it is.
And there's still no end in sight to the growing humanitarian crisis. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed had given Tigray forces 72 hours to surrender, though its leader rejected the ultimatum before it expired on Wednesday. And while African Union envoys traveled to Ethiopia to plead for peace, Prime Minister Ahmed has asked the international community to refrain from intervening in the conflict until the Ethiopian government requests assistance.
Here in France, Prime Minister Jean Castex has detailed the country's plan for easing lockdown. Lifting restrictions will take place in 3 phases, the first phase coming this Saturday, when non-essential shops will be allowed to reopen. Valerie DeKimp with this.
When Emmanuel Macron announced a progressive end to the nationwide lockdown, the country breathed a sigh of relief. But many questions remained unanswered. On Thursday, it was the Prime Minister's turn to unveil the details of the country's strategy. This weekend, shops will be allowed to reopen under new guidelines. They must allocate 8 square meters for each customer. They will be authorized to be open on Sundays and until 9 p.m. Driving schools and real estate agencies can also resume their activities as long as they abide by a strict protocol. As expected, bars and restaurants will remain closed. Some 400,000 workers in several industries will benefit from yet another stimulus plan, guaranteeing a minimum wage of €900 per month. But perhaps the most anticipated announcement was about Christmas. The French Prime Minister confirmed that on Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, the curfew would be lifted exceptionally, while urging people to remain vigilant.
It's imperative to limit the number of people around the table and to avoid large gatherings. Alongside the Health Ministry, we will be providing further details before the holiday, as well as clearer recommendations.
Cases of COVID-19 have dropped by 30% from 45,000 daily infections in early November to 15,000. The country is on track to hit the 5,000 mark by the middle of December. But for the French Prime Minister, it is still premature to say life will soon go back to normal.
The UN has warned the coronavirus pandemic could wipe out 25 years of progress towards gender equality. A new report confirms that women have shouldered more of the burden of domestic tasks and childcare while losing out on employment and education opportunities. For more on this, let's turn to our business editor, Kate Moody. Kate, tell us more about the findings of this UN research.
Well, the financial, domestic, and educational inequality that existed long before the pandemic has gotten significantly worse. This report looks into unpaid care and domestic work in 38 countries during COVID-19, of course, a period during which families around the world have spent more time in their homes and more time looking after their children as schools and daycare centers have been closed. Women around the world have spent an average 31 hours per week on childcare. That's about 5 hours more than usual. Men have also spent more time with their kids. They've reported about 3.5 hours more on childcare per week. Now, both women and men say that they are doing more domestic chores, including cleaning and shopping, although the percentage is slightly higher for women, and it's significantly higher for women in certain countries. Meanwhile, far more women than men have dropped out of the labor force altogether. Analysts say that's because there is a greater care burden at the moment, and women find themselves having to make that professional sacrifice. That could create a real ripple effect that will outlast the pandemic itself. It could impact women's economic progress, independence, and mental and emotional health.
So, what solutions does the UN suggest?
Well, first off, both employers and governments need to acknowledge that there is this problem of unpaid work. During the pandemic, the UN says that keeping childcare centers open as much as is possible or reasonable will be a really key step here. Offering extra paid family leave could also allow for a lot more flexibility and equality going ahead. The report does point out that governments around the world have unleashed really unprecedented measures to contain both the economic and social fallout of the pandemic. But it says that the bulk of those responses have been blind to women's needs in particular. The head of the UN's Gender Inequality Unit saying that without targeted action, there's a real risk of reverting back to 1950s gender stereotypes for many societies around the world.
All right, now let's just pivot quickly to the U.S. now. Millions of people have traveled for Thanksgiving, despite health warnings to stay at home.
Around 5 million people have been screened through airport security just since Friday. Those are levels absolutely unseen in airports since March. The numbers are still down about 60% when you compare them to last Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, of course, is the busiest travel week of the year in the United States. It is still, though, the largest amount of travel that's been recorded since the beginning of the pandemic. Millions more people, of course, were traveling on the roads as well. Now, many families in the United States celebrate Thanksgiving in big groups, sometimes 2 or 3 dozen 100,000 people gathered around a single table. Surveys suggest that many of them have scaled down their traditional gatherings or that they'll be observing social distancing or mask guidelines. But one poll suggested that 39% of Americans hadn't changed any of their travel plans for this holiday, despite an uptick in coronavirus cases and repeated and urgent warnings from health officials. One top expert in the United States warning this situation as setting up a possible surge on top of a surge. Now, Canadians celebrated their Thanksgiving a couple of weeks ago, and there was a spike in coronavirus infections despite similar warnings there. And a lot of people see this as a real cautionary tale for countries around the world less than a month before Christmas.
All right. Thanks, Kate. France 24's business editor, Kate Moody. That's all from us for now, but do stay tuned for more. You're watching France 24.